Welcome. I'm so glad you're joining our talk today. Thanks for watching. I'm excited to talk about what technologists need to know about the world of election administration so that you can plan how best to apply your technical skills to help save our democracy. Look, before we really dig in, I want to start by just being upfront and saying, let's be honest, the topic of elections, it's a pretty rough topic these days, no matter your political stripes. Talking about it is dicey. There's a lot to be concerned about, and there's a lot of tough conversations to be had. Jimmy Fallon, he put it really well when he talked about just kind of how drawn out everything is and how it can make us feel. He said, today felt like waking up with a hangover and then realizing that you're still at the bar. And I thought that was a pretty good way of putting it. Other people captured their feelings around election night this way. Look, I've been working in elections for 20 years, and it definitely feels like in the last 12 months, I've probably gotten more gray hairs on my beard and in my hair than in the previous 12 years straight. But to settle down, seriously, these are very challenging times in elections, and the stakes are high. Election officials in particular have been under more stress than anyone, even to the point of being harassed, intimidated, and threatened with violence like never before. That has to stop. It absolutely has to stop. And we've got big issues to solve, because let's be really clear about what's at stake. That's what's at stake, our democracy. And we need to be really clear about that. So what does technology have to do with solving that problem? Well, with respect to technology, none is more consequential to democracy than election technology, of course. When it works well, it helps contribute to confidence in the election outcomes, strong democracy, and social cohesion. But if it's not done right, it contributes to mistrust in government, toxic hyper-partisanship, and that can, of course, feel totally disheartening. But I'll tell you, at this moment, the OSED Institute is optimistic. I'm going to say that again. We are optimistic. And I'll tell you the reason why is because we can't think of another time when so many Americans have been so interested in the topic of election integrity. So we actually view this as a golden opportunity to roll up our sleeves, to try to turn down the temperature on division, and to work together to increase public confidence in elections. But here's part of the challenge, and here's part of how we got here. A lot of the concerns and claims that are made about elections and election integrity, they totally lack context about how election administration actually works. In fact, a lot of the claims are based on a misunderstanding of how elections work, and that makes it easier for misinformation to spread. So fundamentally, here's why we're doing this talk. It's because everything looks suspicious when you don't know how anything works. Today's talk is a primer on technology in the election administration operating environment, what's common, what's not, and what you should anticipate, again, so that you can best apply your skills. I want to say up front that I do recognize that there's going to be different levels of experience in the audience today. For some of you, this is probably going to feel like election administration 101. But I know there's also more experienced folks. And for you, I hope you'll consider this a kind of literature review, just to remind you of what's the most important stuff in the landscape. So let me start, especially for those of you that are newer, you might be asking, okay, how hard can this be, right? I mean, voting tech, it's not rocket science, right? I've seen these voting machines. I'm going to complicate that picture for you, because the list of requirements for modern voting systems is long. They have to support complex data for thousands of jurisdictions with potentially millions of voters. Within those jurisdictions, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different ballot styles. The system has to support audio for every single text string on the ballot, and it has to support translations of every single audio and text string. And it has to do that for potentially up to a dozen or so foreign languages. Obviously, the system has to be extremely accurate, even though it relies on imperfect and fallible technology. And in this day and age, it has to be secure enough to protect against attacks from foreign nation states or from domestic bad actors. But even though it has to do all of that, it still has to be usable and intuitive enough for average voters and poll workers and election officials to use, even if they're not especially tech savvy. It also needs features to accommodate voters with disabilities, in addition to the general voting population. And of course, it has to support transparency and verifiability. And here's the kicker, it has to do that while also absolutely protecting voter privacy, anonymity, and equality. And after doing all of those functional requirements, it still has to be affordable enough for cash-strapped counties and townships to buy, because the federal government has actually been pretty modest about its funding for elections infrastructure. So you can see that's a pretty long list. Oh, I totally forgot one other thing. Yeah, the peaceful transfer of power depends on public confidence in the performance of the voting system. So if you go back and ask, hey, it's not rocket science, right? Some people have said it's harder. I want to emphasize also that election technology is just part of a much larger and more complicated system. It's just one piece of the puzzle, because election administration is multi-layered. The tech is not operated in a vacuum. In fact, election administration and procedures impose all kinds of limitations on how the technology is used. And a lot of those limitations might be different from what you're used to in other more traditional technology operating environments. The other reason that the election problem is such a tough one to solve is because, in addition to solving for the technology challenges, elections still have to meet 5 really important pillars of US election administration. Elections have to comply with laws, court decisions, and policies at the federal and state and local levels. Of course, elections have to be administered in a fair way. They have to be totally free from political influence or manipulation. The outcomes have to accurately reflect the intent of the electorate. And they have to be based on voter-centric practices. Elections have to support equal opportunity for all eligible voters to participate in the democratic process. And finally, election administration has to meet the bar of transparency, because in order to support confidence and trust, election officials have to be accountable to the public. So it's a tough problem. At the OSET Institute, we use a shorthand, which is VAST. Elections have to be verifiable, accurate, secure, and transparent. So let's dig deeper into 3 big questions. What's unique about elections in the US? How are different types of technology used in actual elections? And given that landscape, how can you help? Where can you apply your skills? So let's start by talking about what's different about US elections. Most people start with the idea that's most important, and that is election administration in the US is decentralized. There is no uniform system of election administration. In fact, depending on how you slice it, there's 8,000 to 10,000 different elections that are going on a national presidential election day. There's also a limited federal role. The 10th Amendment of the Constitution leaves the administration of elections up to the states. They decide the time, place, and manner for how elections are actually run. So not surprisingly, that leads to widely different practices that you're going to see from state to state. There's different voting methods, there's different mail practices, there's different prohibitions on certain types of technology, like wireless transmission of results, for example. So as a starting point, if you ask yourself, all right, what does this mean for me? It's really, really important that you get to know how elections are run in your county, your township, or your state. What's local is what matters, because those practices are going to be different from others. As a starting point, if you want to take a quick look, Verified Voting has an excellent resource out on the web that's called the Verifier, and it is a database of all the different types of voting technology that's implemented across the whole country, state by state, and even county by county. So it richly shows you how much of a patchwork it is. Now, despite that patchwork and despite all the diversity, there are some important common threads in election technology. It's a mixture of network connected infrastructure versus other components that certainly in terms of best practices and are usually, they're air gapped. I'll return to that topic in more detail later, but it's basically the difference between network connected voter registration and reporting infrastructure versus the voting devices themselves. Another important thing to note that's different from other environments is that in elections, a lot of these technology components, they move around. They need to be transported from a warehouse onto a truck out into the world so that people can vote. It's not simply servers in a data center, for example. You have e-poll books and voting machines that need to be taken to senior center or the library or the civic center so that people can vote. And that means that in this world, Physical security and procedural controls and chain of custody and documentation are very, very important. And finally, the use of removable media for data transfer is very common in election administration technology. I want to dig a little deeper into this distinction between election technology versus voting technology. The second one, voting tech, is a subset of the broader picture. And to think about it, you just need to make three critical distinctions. There's everything that has to do with registration and voter services before voting. So voter registration databases or online services, like if a voter wants to request a mail ballot, for example, that's one layer before voting. That's separate and distinct from casting ballots, and casting ballots is also separate from counting votes. It's only the last two things, casting ballots and counting votes, that are part of the voting system, strictly speaking. And voting systems are typically air-gapped. In contrast, election technology like voter registration systems or web-based reporting systems on the back end are typically network connected. Some more common threads. Voting technology in the US is sourced by a very small number of vendors. This is a really consolidated market. About 80% of the marketplace is served by just two big vendors. And if you add the third smallest vendor, those three companies alone have about 95% of the market. There's also high barriers to entry because certification and voting systems are specialized and complicated. There are very few new market entrants, new companies that have gotten into this industry in the last 10 years. The other thing that many are aware of is that the pace of innovation is slow. If you've seen voting technology up close, even new equipment, it can feel kind of old. Voting systems also are not updated very often. They kind of feel frozen in time. One thing that surprises a lot of people is that even the so-called latest, greatest voting technology products, the ones from the major vendors, many of which were just bought and implemented as recently as 2018, 2019, 2020, even the newest, latest, greatest products are all designed to comply with 16-year-old federal standards. That's right, 16 years old, all the way back to 2005. And if you need a little perspective on what technology was like back then, it was before the iPhone had even been invented. If you wanted a smartphone, you were using a BlackBerry because that was the only thing with a physical keyboard. And 2005 is also the same year that there was a little service that was launched for the first time to upload videos. Yeah, it's called YouTube. That was in 2005. And many of you may be surprised to know that there are systems out in the field that were used in the 2020 election that are running on the Windows 2000 operating system, and they have not had any security updates in 15 years. The final thing that's important to note about voting systems is that it's really hard to make agile changes. Why is that? It's because certification. So let's dig into that. One thing I want to be clear, when I talk about certification in this elections context, I'm not talking about certification of results. I'm talking about the certification of voting systems, which basically means what's necessary to get them approved for use. And in the US, we have a two-tiered system. And the fact that it's two-tiered results in really long time horizons. There's a federal certification layer that is administered by the US Election Assistance Commission, or the EAC. And the EAC is who runs the program that tests for compliance with the federal standards that are called the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, or the VVSG. But complying with the federal standards, the VVSG, that's just the first step. That's just table stakes, or the prerequisite for a whole separate additional state-by-state process. And every state has its own unique approval process for voting systems, with one exception, Mississippi, which doesn't require certification of voting systems. Approximately 40 states require some form of testing to the federal VVSG standards, and they again get to decide whether they want to make that a prerequisite. That's why it is a voluntary program. This is what leads to long time horizons. A federal certification program can 3 to 18 months, depending on whether it's a relatively small modification that's being made to a system, or whether it's a brand new system that maybe takes a year and a half to get through the whole process. And state certification can also take another 3 to 12 months. So when you add those two timelines together, by the time product hits the streets for election officials to actually buy it and use it, it's already behind the times. It's already prematurely obsolete to some extent, because of course the threat environment is constantly evolving. A couple other things about certification. Voting systems, they end up being very rigid because certification creates the rigidity. There's a lot of different components in a voting system, including back office computers that are called the election management system versus your actual voting devices, for example, your scanners. And every single one of those components has its own major and minor software revision, for example. But the way certification works is the certification applies to a specific system configuration. So if something in the software of any one of those components needs to change for some reason, that effectively results in a totally different system configuration, which can trigger a new round of retesting and recertification. There are some policies for truly minor changes that are called de minimis, but just as an example, in voting systems, security patches cannot simply be rolled out to already deployed systems in the way that you can do in other technology environments, for example. So for all of these reasons, net, the big vendors prefer to kind of rest on their old product and to not have to go through certification more than necessary. And so lots of times they end up just making smaller changes around the margins and less frequently. What it ultimately results in is these dynamics, they incentivize doing less innovation, not more. And one last thing I want to mention that you may be interested to know is that open-ended penetration testing is actually relatively rare. There are some exceptional states, California and Colorado come to mind, and the EAC this year for the first time is trying to launch a pilot pen testing program. But as far as most of the voting systems that are out in the field and have been used, the ones that are designed to those 2005 standards, most of those have never gone through pen testing in the traditional way that you think of it. So let's talk a little bit about how the different layers of technology work together and how this is a complex, arrangement. In this diagram, I really just kind of want to focus on two main things. There's a lot of moving parts in election technology. Overall, the system is more complicated than you may think. And again, there's different layers. Only some of those layers are the voting system. Others have to do with pre-voting or reporting. And that's, again, why you get this combination of some of it is network connected and some of it is not. So in this example, just looking at the 4 different rows, you have voter registration. You have processes that have to happen before voting begins, namely the preparation of ballots, the voting itself, again, casting and counting, and then reporting. And each one of those has its own moving parts. In voter registration, you have voter registration databases. You have the increasing popularity of electronic poll books. Those also have their own software managers for the poll books. And then there's those online services that I mentioned earlier. Managing the election data and laying out ballots is part of the election management system in the elections office. And then when you look at the voting band, again, precinct scanners, central count scanners for mail ballots, for example, accessible voting devices. And then you also have the tabulation system. Once again, a computer that is in the central elections office, and that is distinct from web-based reporting that voters and the media use to consume those election night results. Unofficial election nights reporting is simply receiving data exports from the system that actually counts ballots, and it's displaying all of those. So you can see, again, multi-layered complex system. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just about the technology. In fact, increasingly, paper records are a really important way to compensate for technology security vulnerabilities and to reduce risk. Now, generally speaking, in recent years, the trend here is positive because in the most recent election, upward of 90% of the ballots cast included some form of a paper record compared to a few years ago when paperless direct recording electronic devices were more common. And if you're wondering, yes, there are still paperless DREs out there that are being used. And in fact, some counties just bought new generations of paperless DREs as recently as 2017. But one thing I want to emphasize about paper is that not all paper records are created equal, and the different formats present more additional controversies and more types of risk. You have to pay attention to the difference between traditional format paper ballots versus machine marked paper ballots that encode voter choices in barcodes or QR codes and so forth. I know there's some of you in the audience that are familiar with that topic. I don't have time today to go into it, but I'll sum up this topic of paper by saying that given the technology vulnerabilities that of course exist in complex computing devices, the critical question to keep in your mind, is the paper record a record of what the voter did, or is it a record of what a machine did? Because of course, we can't simply assume that the machines are trustworthy. The other reason that paper is so important is because of post-election audits. Look, with these complex systems, it's not surprising that the increasing consensus is it's unlikely that we're going to plug every single hole in the dam. And because we can't plug every hole, that's why having robust paper trails and robust post-election audits are the most important thing that we can do right now to enhance election integrity. That is part of what's called evidence-based elections. Many of you have probably heard that phrase. The idea of evidence-based elections is that you want processes that produce public evidence that the reported winners really won and the reported losers really lost. And what's central to evidence-based elections is the idea of software independence. There's lots of different ways to state software independence, but in a nutshell, it's the idea that the integrity of the election outcome cannot be dependent on trusting the correctness of the software. It has to be capable of being independently verified. Generally speaking, what happens in an audit is you have human beings that are reviewing a trustworthy trail of paper records that can reliably be said to reflect the voter's intent, and you compare those records to the voting system's reported totals. The gold standard for post-election audits is the risk limiting audit, which one of its benefits is it's a method of doing an audit that can be very efficient because you can achieve a high statistical confidence that your results are correct based on reviewing a pretty modest number of random ballots, depending on the margin size. I want to emphasize, there is a growing interest in post-election audits, and rightly so. Done correctly, they are absolutely essential. But it's really important to emphasize that there are specific best practices for audits. Although I don't have time to go into the details here, we'll provide a link with several resources at the end. And I want to mention that one of the key architects of risk limiting audits is Professor of Statistics, Dr. Philip Stark. He actually invented the RLA, and in full disclosure, he sits on the OSED Institute's Board of Advisors. Now, beyond post-election audits, I want to mention one more thing. And it involves process. It's important to understand that election night results, what you're seeing and what the media is reporting, those are not official results, and they're not the final results. They're not complete at that time. The official certification of results come only after a routine and pretty lengthy post-election day process that is called the canvass. I want to emphasize that ballots cast in the United States are counted in the United States, period. And part of that counting is, again, the canvass. When election officials do the canvass, which can take weeks, they are reviewing all of the paperwork that documents how the election was run. They're reconciling numbers, and they're accounting for every single ballot that was cast to ensure that every valid vote cast is included in the election totals, and that invalid ones are, of course, not. Now that we've looked at the landscape for election technology and how it actually gets used, let's wrap up with thinking about ways that you can help if you want to get more engaged to enhance election integrity. A few starter thoughts. Although there's a lot of different ways to potentially get involved, here's some common things to bear in mind. First, if you really are going to start working more closely in your community with local election officials or making contact with the state, be prepared to be patient. Remember, you're dealing with critical infrastructure, and the politics and so forth around these issues can be delicate. You should expect a background check if you're really going to get plugged in, and that's a good thing. I also want to remind you, learn about the practices in your state and locality. Again, at the state level, that's usually the Secretary of State. Less common, but it might also be the Board of Elections. And in your immediate community, That's typically the county clerk or the township clerk. I also want to mention that ways to get engaged, you can do that either on an individual basis, or you might see if your local officials would consider being open to an advisory group. Some of them do that as well. As far as ideas on how you can apply your tech skills, here's a starter list, and there's a lot more. If you have a particular expertise in cybersecurity, obviously helping with network vulnerabilities is going to be very valuable. That really means voter registration systems or election night reporting systems. Those are typically administered at the county or the state level. If you also have expertise in cyber incident contingency planning, you can help with that. More and more election officials are learning about the importance of this, but it's new to a lot of them and they need help. And really just kind of being a hand to hold and being a kind of cyber navigator could be very valuable. If you're most interested in helping with election security in your area, in your locality, there's a good reason that a lot of people say, hey, a great introduction is just to volunteer as a poll worker to start. That will provide you with an awareness of the overall operating environment and give you a really good trusted foundation to work more closely with local staff. If you're really interested in the specific technical vulnerabilities in the deployed voting systems in your state, the best people to talk to are the state certification authorities. Again, those are typically in the Secretary of State's office or the Board of Elections. And it may also, a good place to start is that certification records for voting systems with details of the testing that happened and the technical analysis and any vulnerabilities, that's usually publicly available. If you have sufficient expertise, you can also support the standards creation process at the National Institute of Standards and Technology or with the Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. For example, you may be surprised, there are currently no federal standards for voter registration systems or for electronic poll books. You can always bone up more on best practices for post-election audits. And finally, if you have expertise in helping to protect the security of websites, you can help election officials to protect and secure all their public communication channels, public websites, social media, and so forth. And that can be especially valuable for smaller counties because a lot of them just don't have those kinds of resources. So let me leave you with some takeaway thoughts. I hope that today's talk has helped you to see that enhancing election integrity involves more than solving some really hard technology problems. It definitely requires that, but remember, the tech is just one piece of the puzzle. If I've done nothing else today, I hope I can help you understand how the world of elections is really complicated. Again, there's all those different layers of law and policy and procedure. All of that imposes constraints on how the technology gets used and on what might be possible in the future. I also want to say thank you for watching. Seriously, thank you. The elections community really wants and needs more technology experts. We want more security-minded and tech-savvy people of all genders, all races, all creeds, all political stripes to step up. So thank you for doing that. On that note, I also want to emphasize another important point. To have a productive partnership between technologists and election officials, it's really, really important that both sides have a really healthy mutual respect. I know that as technology experts, you all have a deep appreciation for just how complex technology can be and where the vulnerabilities might lie. But I hope that today has also helped you to see that's also true on the other side. Again, elections are a complicated business. These are professionals. They care deeply about democracy, and they have a deep level of expertise that I hope you can also learn from. And when both sides work together, that's when great things happen. If today's talk has helped you to feel more motivated and just to have a better practical sense of how to get more involved, then that's great. That's what we were hoping to do. And then with your new knowledge, I hope that you can educate more people as well. Together, we can try to ensure that more accurate information gets spread more widely and that misinformation and misunderstandings don't. At the end of the day, this is what it takes to increase public confidence in elections and to defend our democracy. Thank you so much for being a part of that, and have a great rest of your day.